Welcome to Charm of the Wilderness, where we embark on a journey through the stunning landscapes of our national parks and public lands, expanding our understanding of climate justice and Indigenous justice along the way. I'm Elizabeth Dorr, your guide in exploring the rich tapestry of our national parks and public lands, discovering not only their breathtaking beauty, but also the vital lessons they hold for our planet's future, as well as the challenging history and current political context of these parks and public lands. Join me as I talk to inspiring, innovative, and driven people working in environmental justice, climate science, Indigenous education, equity in the outdoors, and more to delve into pressing environmental issues and learn how we can advocate for a more equitable and sustainable world for all. Hey everybody, welcome to Charm of the Wilderness podcast. Before we get started, I just wanted to note that we had a little bit of technical difficulty with Shane's recording. Not everything uploaded at the end, and so we lost about 10 minutes of the conversation. But as I went back through, it looked like we had a lot of most of the content that I wanted to have there was there. So it was really awesome. And it was such an incredible conversation. I did ask Shane to send me a couple of voice recordings to kind of fill in some of the gaps at the very end of the podcast. Also, we have a situation. I also had an issue with downloading his file and I had to strangely screen record so that I could save it somehow. And it turned out I did that during my son. I did that during dinner time when my son and I were cooking dinner. And so about, I don't know, it'll be about between sometime the 10 and 12 minute mark, you'll start hearing my son yelling in the background. I did not realize that it was going to be capturing ambient noise. I tried to adjust Shane's audio for that, but it's a really important part of the conversation, and so I didn't want to edit that section out. I hope that it's not going to be too distracting for you, but I appreciate your patience with the technical difficulties because this was a really amazing conversation, and Shane is an absolutely lovely human being, so enjoy. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Charm of the Wilderness podcast. I am really excited to talk with Dr. Shane Doyle today. I came across Shane's work a few years ago when a Smithsonian article came out about uncovering the history of Yellowstone. And so it has been on my radar for a long time, and I am really excited to talk to him more about it and also the work that he's been doing since then. So just to give you a little bit of background, Dr. Shane Doyle is a Montana-based scholar, teacher, and community advocate whose work focuses on the history and heritage of Native American tribes of the Northern Great Plains. Shane is an enrolled member of the Apsalaga Nation, and he holds a doctorate in curriculum and instruction from Montana State University. Shane grew up in Crow Agency, and he's built a career around making Native American history and cultural mainstay in everything from Montana's educational system to governmental land management decisions. Whether designing educational curriculums, making films, or singing Northern Plains tribal music, Shane is always focused on serving his community. And he is currently the Indigenous Rights Director of North America for the Nature Conservancy. So that's not a small task, I imagine. So welcome, Shane. I'm really happy to have you here.
What a delight. Yeah, it's been so fun to meet you. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah. Well, first, let's just talk about you. Tell me a little bit about yourself, Sure. Your background, your education, and about what drives you in your work.
Yeah, great. Again, I'm just so honored and happy to be on your program. Like you're really a dynamic person, it feels like, and so I'm so happy to share this time with
thanks,
you.
Shane. I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. So I am from Crow Agency, Montana, which is located in south central Montana along the Little Bighorn River. And I grew up in a town that's just located about a mile or two from the historic Little Bighorn battlefield. And so, I grew up there on the reservation, attended grade school, high school, surrounded by a large extended family. and then came off to Bozeman to go to college. I've got 3 degrees from Montana State University, and it's about a 3-hour drive from Bozeman to the town that I grew up in Crow Agency on the Little Bighorn River. But that 3-hour drive contains a massive amount of geologic, geographic, and cultural history. So I feel like over the past, over my lifetime, especially since I left the reservation as a high school student, I've been trying to learn about how I fit in and what is my inheritance here, what is the deep history of this place, and why and how is it still relevant.
That's amazing. Well, and related to that, I know you do research on places all around Montana and the West, but I'm really curious about the work that you've done in Yellowstone. One of the things we were kind of talking about before I started recording is that there isn't a lot of knowledge among Americans, especially European Americans, about the Indigenous histories and cultures that are linked to the lands of national parks. And so I'd really love to hear more about the work that you've done in Yellowstone and what your team found about the Indigenous histories and cultures that are linked to the lands of national parks. And so I'd really love to hear more about the work that you've done in Yellowstone and what your team found.
I'm continuing to learn. I'm hopefully continuing to share. I've written over half a dozen articles about Yellowstone, published online that folks are interested. I can share the links with you and make them available. So what I've come to discover is that Yellowstone is actually the beating heart of a multicultural zone, a very cosmopolitan area of the Northern Plains, and that it was really the nexus point for tribes from both east and west of the Continental Divide, but also north and south of that very important kind of water boundary, I guess you could call it. And so, the Missouri headwaters, which forms in the Yellowstone Park, really is what I've discovered has kind of become, or has been, a central point for tribal culture since time immemorial.
That's amazing. And what did you find to uncover that history? What was the evidence of that?
Well, I first came to learn about it through studying about my own tribe. And so I was asked by the Yellowstone Institute back in, I think it was about 2015. It's been over 10 years now, to teach a class on the Crow history in Yellowstone Park. And so I was fortunate enough to inherit a good source of materials from a professor at the Little Bighorn College. His name is Dr. Tim McCleary. And he just, gifted me those materials. I kind of mentored under him for a while, learning about the history of the Crow tribe in Yellowstone Park. And then I taught the class for about 5 years. And so during that time, I came to learn there was just a vast amount of cultural, economic, geologic history that's relevant to my tribe. There are many different place names, dozens of place names in the Yellowstone Park that my tribe has named. And all those place names are connected to specific events or qualities within the park, and also connect to other tribes as well. So there's a ceremonial history there in the park that my tribe has of, ancient ceremonies that we practiced and, continue to use to this day. There's origin stories that are based in the park that my tribe has about the, how and why the geothermal features were created and how they're connected to the stars and the people. There's trade routes, and I could go on, but I think I'll pause there.
Yeah, actually, one of the essays that you wrote that you sent me for the National Parks Conservation Association was about some of these stories and retelling these stories. Can you share one or two of those that you think are particularly important to the park or that are significant to you?
Yeah, there's really three primary stories I tend to kind of share with most groups. I share with a lot of educational groups and I've written about, but the one I think is closest to my heart is about the morning star. And so, we all know the morning star comes up before the sun early in the morning in the winter and is either, Venus, most often Venus, but can also be, Polaris, um, depending on, what time of the year you're looking to the east early in the morning. But, the story of the morning star that my tribe has explains how the dragon's mouth geothermal feature was created. And in that story, um, the morning star comes down to the earth, and he's a little boy. And while he's here on the earth as a little boy, he has a lot of superpowers because his dad is actually the sun. And so, yeah, it's an interesting story. There's a lot of similarities to many other ancient mythologies from around the world in this particular story. But the boy, he's down here on the earth, and there's a evil buffalo, a giant evil buffalo that's, just terrorizing communities around the area. And so he takes the buffalo and he sticks him in the ground to protect the people. And, you can still hear and see the buffalo in the ground over there. And when you come up to him, you can hear him growling. And you can see the steam coming out from his mouth. And today, the white people call that the dragon's mouth. But the Crow Indians call that the old buffalo bull. And they say, that's actually the old buffalo that's been stuck in the ground there. And actually behind him, there's a mud pot and kind of boiling mud. And the crows say that that's actually a mountain lion. And that little boy who stuck that buffalo there also stuck a mountain lion behind him to watch over him. So when he eventually comes awake and comes alive again, that mountain lion will jump on him and protect the people.
I love that. I love that. And what part of the park is that in?
Yeah, so that is a zone that's the way to access it if you came from the east or if you came from Gardner, Mammoth area, was you'd have to drive down through the Teddy Roosevelt arch, or no, I'm sorry. Of course, everyone goes through the arch, but there's a little Teddy Roosevelt. Is it loop? Oh man, I'm forgetting the name of the exact area there where you can either go to Cook City.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little fork in the road there.
Yeah.
You can go to Cook City, or you can just keep going to the south. And if you keep going south, you'll eventually come onto that geothermal site. And yeah, again, the dragon's mouth is what we call it today.
That's what the park calls it, the dragon's mouth. Yeah.
Yeah. And the Kiowa actually have a story associated with it. And there's actually a little sign there, and it's one of the very few signs in the park that describes a connection.
No kidding.
And so the Kiowa have a story. Yeah, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one.
No.
Mm-hmm. And they came through the Yellowstone Park when they were on a migratory, transition from the north and heading out onto the southern plains. And when they were in the park there at that particular geothermal site, they had an experience where one of the Kiowa men, they say, went all the way into that hot pot, and went down all the way to the bottom and came back up and, had this like rebirth of the Kiowa Nation at that point.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Well, and that's an example of kind of that being the Yellowstone being a confluence of trade routes for many tribes and the significance that it has for so many people. Mm-hmm. And it also really paints a picture of when when the colonizers came in, when the national parks it was created to be a national park for white recreation, essentially. How many people and communities were displaced from that, and also and the disruption to kind of the trade routes and the connections that tribes had with one another from that displacement. It really like paints that
Yep.
a significant picture of that for sure.
Yeah, and the other piece I should add is that I like to delve a lot into the science of the local ecology, and what we've discovered is that as the Yellowstone River exits the park and flows through the Paradise Valley and out onto the Montana Prairie there, that is one of the most important historic bison hunting zones that we know of on the continent. Yeah, and it's got more, um, the hunters there built rock walls. So there's more infrastructure in that one little area there. There's like 70 miles worth of walls built just to harvest the bison. And so we know that those same hunters were traveling up the river to harvest elk in the Yellowstone Park seasonally, and that it wasn't just one or two or even three or four tribes. That we're talking about over a dozen tribes since time immemorial following that exact same path into the
Mm-hmm.
park, because not only do you have access to all those wonderful things on that magic mountain like obsidian and all the other things you can trade for, but just all of the bison and elk there that were in constant uh, are constantly ready to be harvested, I guess I could say.
Mm-hmm. Wow. What was it like for you personally to learn this science and history through your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm still trying to make meaning from it, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One of the things I also discovered in my research was a map from 1801 that was drawn by a Blackfoot chief, and the map was actually drawn in Canada, and it was drawn for a white man named Peter Fiddler, and it's kind of known popularly as the Fiddler map, Peter Fiddler's map, and that map um, describes 250,000 square miles. And within those 250,000 square miles describes all the tributaries of the Missouri River, the Columbia, and the Snake River. And right in the middle of that map is Yellowstone Park. And so I came to, after learning about that map and studying it and trying to piece it together with everything else I know, it to me, what I've come to learn about Yellowstone Park is it really is the center. It really was the beating heart of this whole area, and that all the tribes knew about it. They all ventured there. And the fact that, when it was created as Yellowstone Park, all of that history was
Mm-hmm.
erased. And that we were told, I guess the American public was told, that Native Americans were afraid of geysers and really didn't venture into the park, and that it really wasn't an important place to them. And in fact, just the opposite, that it was one of the most important places on the map for them, and that tribes, even in Canada, that this is before of course, the 38th parallel and the Canadian border was drawn, but even tribes way up north there recognized that Yellowstone was the center of it all because, for one reason, for the biggest reason, this is where all the
Mm-hmm.
water comes from.
Yeah. That actually kind of makes me a bit emotional too. And I chose Yellowstone in some ways as, being the first national park and also really just kind of this otherworldly place with the most spectacular sights. But that brings like a whole other level of significance about being the center of the Indigenous nation in, of what is now North America. But it really does like add that other layer of importance.
Yeah.
And also like I imagine a lot of the for you and for your community like a sense of grief too, with like the loss of that as or at least being cut off from that center, from that beating heart. And I don't know.
Yeah, it totally does. And the idea now that we have the opportunity to reconnect is exciting and motivating and really exhilarating. I feel like where I live here in Bozeman is really the heart of Northern Plains tribal culture. You know, some people might say Rapid City, South Dakota, or Billings, Montana, or someplace further east of here, but really I think it's Bozeman. And one of the reasons I say that is we have a powwow here in the spring, and tribes come from all over Montana, but also Idaho and Wyoming. And I would say, you know, if you look at Yellowstone Park, and how it's situated with regard to Northern Plains tribal culture, um, and you look at all of the reservations in Montana today, the 7 reservations, the 13 tribes, and how unique and special is that compared to Wyoming, which has 1 reservation and 2 tribes, um, and Colorado, which has, you know, like 2 small tribes, but located up in the mountains and not on the prairie. You know, the Dakotas have a lot of, you know, Indian country, I guess you could call it, but it's pretty much just one language family, you know, the Lakota, Dakota speaking people. And you come here to Montana, which is really, I think I see Montana as the northern portion
Mm.
of Yellowstone Park. And what you find here as the rivers flow out of the Yellowstone Park and into Montana is this is where all the tribes were that hunted buffalo and lived in teepees and had that ceremonial way of life. Once you travel past Yellowstone, when you go south of Yellowstone, like towards Colorado or, you know, in further south, you don't see that same way of life anymore because you don't have all those same pieces to the puzzle. You know, you don't have
Mm.
the lodgepole pines, you don't have the island mountain ranges, you don't have the sources of water and the diverse plant and animal species that make Montana and the northern plains, and really, like I said, the offshoot of Yellowstone Park, this incredibly rich and robust uh,
Mm.
zone of life that was so strong and such a thriving place that the native people who lived here were really the only ones on the continent who did not grow
Mm.
their own crops. These were really the only people who, you know, did not grow corn, beans, and squash outside of like the California groups who, you know,
Okay.
had
Mm-hmm.
a wealth of fish and other natural resources. But yeah, I guess just to you know, don't get me started. But as you can see, there's a lot to share about Yellowstone and why it's important and how we've lost all that and why it's important to get it all back because as we get all that information, all that knowledge back, we you know reconnect in a sacred way to each other and to the land, and it heals us as individuals and as communities, and you know that filters down to the
Absolutely. Well,
ecosystem.
and I think that for all of us, for I'm white, and I feel like I really missed out growing up, learning and understanding this deep, rich history, indigenous history, but also like the indigenous history as it relates to the natural environment, because every culture is so the cultures
Yep.
are built around that specific place, and I feel
Yep.
robbed in a way from like this really deep knowledge. And so I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying, and this project is really a way for me to also do this differently for my own child, for my son, and have these conversations when we're visiting the
Yeah.
parks, and because they are really great places to kind of begin that conversation. We're on indigenous land everywhere. These places were
Yep.
the indigenous cultures and peoples were strategically erased and displaced from the land. I mean, that's the case everywhere, but in order for European, for white leisure, essentially, white elite leisure,
Yep.
and and we have to do a lot to kind of carve our way back to especially for those of us who
Yeah.
aren't steeped in indigenous culture, to really like learn about the land and the peoples. And so I'm curious actually as for recommendations that you might have for people visiting Yellowstone, what do you recommend people do, both learning about the people native to the land, but also like what we should consider as we're visiting as visitors to the land?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought it up. We've got a lot of plans for Yellowstone, and it's taken a while to get everything, into action because we have to raise the money, and we also have to, change the culture within the communications at the Yellowstone Park to want to produce more materials to promote and advocate and educate the public about the native history there. And that's a big lift. It doesn't happen overnight, but it is happening. It's happening slowly. And, currently this administration is not the biggest fan of having diversity within our national parks. And so we're also up against that.
That might be the biggest
To put
understatement
it
of the
mildly.
century. To put it mildly,
Yeah.
indeed.
But one of the things I want to also say is that, you say that, and you made a good point about, white people taking these lands and turning them into leisure for the enjoyment of the people, as Teddy Roosevelt said. But really, these are ceremonial sites, and they advocate a ceremonial way of life because you're not there to extract. You're not there to take animals. You're not there to take obsidian. You're there to have a spiritual, connection to that place. And it could be intellectual, it could be physical, but whatever it is, it's going to be something that's meaningful. And it's going to be something that you're going to take with you and take in your heart, and you're going to want to share it. And that's the beauty of Yellowstone. That's the beauty of every national park, is that these are places set aside for us to heal. And native people, I've always been about that, using the land and utilizing the land to make ourselves whole. And I think that when people go to the Yellowstone and the other parks, they should make a mention to the ranger. How come there's no information about the native people here? That might
Yeah.
prompt them. Maybe
Yeah.
maybe the ranger might have a suggestion to put something in a box, and we can start getting metrics on those kinds of things. But I can tell you that coming soon to the Yellowstone Park, we're going to have a lot more signage. We're going to have, hopefully an app is in the works that will
Ooh,
share. Oh,
that's
yeah, it's
amazing.
incredible how many native histories. Yeah, I mean, it's really hopeful. It's exciting. There's just so many, everything from the music to the ceremonies, to the dances. I mean, I could go on and on. The Yellowstone Park is the glue that connects all of those things, and we just really want to celebrate that and
Mm.
share that with people so that people can leave the park and have the kind of feeling you have when you leave Europe, or when you leave
Mm.
Africa or Asia, or Australia, or someplace else in the world, where that ancient umbilical cord that we have to all those ancestors that have lived on this earth before us has not been broken.
Mm.
When we go to those ancient places, like even Denmark for me, when I first went there, when I was working for the University of Copenhagen, and we sequenced that 12,600-year-old child here, going to Copenhagen to me felt a lot like going home.
Okay, here's about the place where the files that I had got lost. And so I am going to include Shane's voice messages here with some information to kind of fill in some of the gaps about his experience in Scandinavia. And then also there is some information about a teepee village that he is working to plan in Yellowstone, and then we're going to conclude. So I just wanted to also say it was such a pleasure having Shane. He's just a wonderful human, and hopefully you'll hear from him again here.
I wanted to talk about my experience when I went to Denmark when I was working for the University of Copenhagen, and what it was like to be in a country and a place that is known as a homeland to the people who live there. And there's an unbroken chain, a history, a memory that goes back, since time immemorial, about what people have done there, the names, the family lineages, the economics, the fishing, the sailing, just all the things associated with Denmark that the people there all knew and were able to trace back. Here in America, we just don't have that same experience because of the colonial processes that work to erase that ancient history and deep connection that people have had here that you only get through generation upon generation upon generation of living on the land and coming to know the plants, the animals, the water, the weather, the climate, and being able to express all that through your culture, your language, your collective memory as a community. That's really what it feels like to come home to someplace. And, of course, Scandinavia is not the only place in the world that has that kind of a deep historical connection. Most of the rest of the world that hasn't been colonized still maintains that. And so I think it's important that we are able to reconnect to the Indigenous history here and believe and understand that that's part of our inheritance, whether or not, we're Indigenous or not, but we live here now. And if we're born here, we're native to this land. And so, it's our responsibility to learn those stories and learn about that culture. And it's not easy because, there has been so much work to erase it, but it is coming back. And just wanted to say that, there are many of us working in education around Montana and the greater Yellowstone who are trying to take on these issues and, looking forward to including more Native history and culture and information about the history and also the present day communities, the Indigenous people that call Yellowstone their homeland. We hope to have signage in Yellowstone Park, more curriculum in the public schools. And it's just, I think, an effort that is going to become more focused in the years to come because there's been more of a reawakening and more of a coming home, a feeling of coming home to the Yellowstone Park for many of the tribes. Myself and many of my colleagues in Indian country, academics and others, historians, are hoping to establish an annual teepee village in the Yellowstone National Park that will occur every year in September. And there will be a teepee for each tribal community who knows Yellowstone as their homeland. And that teepee will accommodate a historian, an elder, and a youth practitioner, someone who's learning about the stories and learning about their connection to the park through a mentor. And then, we will welcome public schools and visitors from around the region and across the world, of course, to learn, to share, and to come to understand Yellowstone as really a rich cultural zone that has thus far been widely known for all of its geothermal and other amazing geographic features, but has an equally amazing historical and cultural identity. And I think people are excited to learn about it. And as Native people, we are looking forward to sharing that. So that's something to look forward to in the years to come. And I'm just excited to be able to be a part of that and to see it all come to fruition. So, we're just hoping to set up the next generation so that no one knows what it feels like in the future to not be connected to that place and know it as our homeland and be welcomed there, and for the world to know that as our homeland as well. So thank you for the opportunity to allow me to speak on that.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of Charm of the Wilderness. I hope you felt inspired to appreciate the richness of our public lands and national parks and the vital role they play in the climate justice movement. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. You can also receive these episodes right in your inbox by subscribing to Charm of the Wilderness on Substack. Together, we can raise awareness and foster a deeper connection with nature and each other. Until next time, keep exploring the wild charm around you, and remember, every little action counts in the fight for our planet. Stay curious and connected.